most populous country, Ethiopia.
Ethiopia is confronting what the UN calls a full-scale
The ensuing conflict has already involved neighboring states and shaken the Horn of Africa.
In the recent weeks and months, world-renowned big media outlets such as CNN, Al Jazeera and others have been reporting the human rights abuse and genocide in Tigray and Oromia regions in Ethiopia, atrocities and war crime of which humanity have never seen in the last decades. However, most of the journalist report and recent analysis completed points toward that act of war crime committed by the current Ethiopian government National Army. Even though the perpetrators are part of the government led by the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and Eritrean, the special force who are authority monger that are directly tied to this act of terror, targeting innocent civilians in Tigray and west part of Oromia, are the so-called Amhara militia, or the Amhara Special Force.
Armed men in uniform leading a group towards a cliff edge. Bodies appear strewn across the ground. A man is urged to throw one off the cliff. These graphic videos and others like it were passed to the BBC and began circulating on social media last month.
During the last couple weeks Ethiopian parliamentary streaming, the Prime Minister himself confessed about the rape of innocent women, which he also insinuated the act of rape as a tool of war with the scarifies the same Amhara terrorist militia group are doing for the current government.
ሴቶች እኮ አሁን በወንድ የተደፈሩት የኛ ወታደሮች ግን በሳንጃ ተደፍረዋል ስለነሱ የሚያነሳ ሰው የለም.
This group are nothing and does not represent any population in Ethiopia whatsoever. They are the right-wing neo-racist, full of hatred toward the entire ethnic group in Ethiopia led by political parties with the same ethno-religious background. Their current and future manifesto is to kill more and more innocent civilians from Oromo, Amhara, Tigray and others to instigate chaos after chaos, hiding under the umbrella of the current government by misleading the local media outlets. Any atrocities that will be done in Ethiopia going forward will be conspired on the Oromo Prosperity Party, who is also part of the Abiy administration, or TPLF or Oromo Liberation Front, OLF, when in reality the responsible group for all of the recent atrocities and war crimes in Wallo, Tigray and Welaga regions are conducted by the Amhara militia or special force. The footage you are about to see shows that Amhara militia dragging injured innocent Oromo civilians out of the Red Cross ambulance vehicle and stabbing with knife to make sure they are all dead. For peace to prevail in Ethiopia, the Human Rights Watch needs to bring the authority and political parties who led this terrorist group to International Court of Criminal Apprehension. History is much more the product of chaos than of conspiracy. This is Isaac Mo from Bultu Media.
In Ukraine, that the world could forget what is happening in Tigray, where for 17 months there has been a conflict which, as the Nobel Order said, has led to the mass starvation of almost 7 million people, where blockades have been used in order to starve people to death, and where rape has been used as a weapon of war. Doesn't the Nobel Lord agree that these are war crimes, and that within his own department we should be collecting the evidence, and will he give an assurance that we will bring to justice those who are responsible for these heinous crimes?
My Lords, what I can give the assurance on the Noble Lord's final point is we will do all we can to bring these perpetrators to account, irrespective of where the conflict is. And Tigray is no exception. We have been in the region working with key partners, including specific experts, for example, on gathering information directly from survivors of sexual violence to ensure we can start building the evidence base. And as the Noble Lord is aware, in Ukraine we're working very closely with the ICC, but I can give the more general assurance that notwithstanding Ukraine, we are not taking our eyes off the ball. We welcome the recent inroads and indeed the truce called in Yemen, and as the Noble Lord knows, we ourselves have stood firm in our contribution to the people of Afghanistan through, again, endorsing £286 million in the next financial year in support for the people of Afghanistan.
Let's take you now to Ethiopia, where rebel forces in Tigray say they've seized a major town in a new offensive there. A rebel spokesman says the town of Raya was taken after federal and Amhara forces withdrew. Now, it's the most intense fighting scene since rebels took the main city of Mekelle in June. In the last few hours, the UN Human Rights Council's passed a resolution expressing deep concern about abuses in Tigray. It's calling for the withdrawal of Eritrean troops, which it says are exacerbating the conflict. It comes as fighting is also being reported in several refugee camps in the region. Well, let's take a quick look at how this conflict unfolded. The TPLF dominated Ethiopian politics for nearly 30 years until Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed came to power in 2018. Now, Abiy ordered a military operation against the group in Tigray in November. He said it attacked army bases. Well, the TPLF claimed that they were being unfairly targeted. Tigray opposition parties say more than 50,000 people have been killed, while the UN says more than 400,000 have been pushed into famine. Last month, the African Union launched an independent inquiry into alleged human rights abuses in the region after widespread accounts of massacres and sexual violence against civilians. Well, Matt Bryden is a strategic advisor with Sahan Research. That's a think tank focusing on politics and security in the Horn of Africa. He joins us by Skype from Nairobi. Good to have you with us on the news, sir. We've given some of the context and the background here, but let's focus on that new military push that the Tigrayans have made. What do you think they're hoping to achieve here?
Well, they've taken now essentially all of southern Tigray, and the leadership has announced that it intends to liberate every inch of Tigrayan territory. So I think what we're seeing is the first of several offenses that are likely to take place over the coming weeks. If the southern flank of Tigray is now considered secure, then I would expect the Tigrayan Defense Forces to focus their attention to the north, where there are still Eritrean troops inside Tigray, in the border areas, and then also to push west into lands that have been annexed by neighboring Amhara state, are claimed as ancestral Amhara lands, and are now under the occupation of Amhara special forces and militias. And that theater is going to be particularly important because Tigray is essentially under an embargo, and the TDF is anxious to open a corridor for both humanitarian supplies and presumably for its own needs as well.
So let's talk about the humanitarian situation then. Are the Tigray Liberation Fronts, are they likely to get this corridor opened? Because the UN have been saying that hundreds of thousands of people are now in famine. Certainly the situation is dire at the best of times. I mean, what hope do you think there is of this humanitarian situation in Tigray improving with these latest developments?
Well, it doesn't look good. Despite the federal government announcing that it would allow humanitarian access, resume humanitarian flights, let aid agencies do their work, very little has happened. Flights have not resumed to Mekelle, so some aid workers have not been able to return. Food and other much needed goods have been tied up in bureaucratic procedures or held at checkpoints in neighboring Amhara and Afar regions. So there have only been a very small number of convoys with food reaching Tigray. In addition, the federal government has essentially imposed a sort of siege on Tigray, cutting off all telecommunications, shutting down electricity, and preventing all movement in and out of the state's borders. So it's essential for the TDF. If the Ethiopian government won't allow aid into the region, then they're going to have to fight their way to the Sudanese border and to see if they can attract assistance that way.
Is this legal in humanitarian terms to effectively put this region and these refugee camps under siege?
Well, I can't speak as to whether it's legal. The United States has characterized it as, or at least parts of this conflict, as ethnic cleansing. And I think the level of violence and systematic atrocities against civilians, destruction of food crops, slaughtering of the livestock that they need, destruction of seeds that they would have been, in theory, they would have already planted for the farming season. All of this suggests a campaign that at least approaches genocidal intent, if not simply ethnic cleansing as the Americans have characterized it.
OK, I'm afraid we're out of time, but it was great to get your thoughts and your perspective. That's Matt Bryden, Strategic Advisor with Sahan Research. Thank you.
The conflict in northern Ethiopia was devastating. Men, women, and children were killed. Women and girls were subject to horrific forms of sexual violence. Thousands were forcibly displaced from their homes. Entire communities were specifically targeted based on their ethnicity. Many of these actions were not random or a mere byproduct of war. They were calculated and deliberate. After the department's careful review of the law and the facts, I've determined that members of the Ethiopian National Defense Forces, Eritrean Defense Forces, Tigray People's Liberation Front Forces, and Amhara forces committed war crimes during the conflict in northern Ethiopia. Members of the Ethiopian National Defense Forces, the Eritrean Defense Forces, and Amhara forces also committed crimes against humanity, including murder, rape, and other forms of sexual violence and persecution. Members of the Amhara forces committed the crime against humanity of deportation or forcible transfer and committed ethnic cleansing through their treatment of Tigrayans in western Tigray.
In Ethiopia, a long-standing partner of the United States, the case is starkly different. A country that has been home to some of the most impressive development gains and economic growth anywhere on the continent, and a regional anchor of stability and security, now finds itself mired in conflict. The government's brutal campaign against the people of Tigray has put the country's people at risk of a prolonged civil war, and the people of Tigray at grave risk of imminent famine. In both Sudan and Ethiopia, we cannot assume a predetermined outcome. Sudan's trajectory is promising, but spoilers abound, and people are impatient for swifter change. Ethiopia's current path is deeply troubling, but all stakeholders there can still choose peace, pulling back from the brink. In both Sudan and Ethiopia, the United States wants to see citizens enjoy dignity, end violence, and expand economic opportunity. But too often, a lack of compromise, a winner-take-all mindset, and a prioritization by some leaders of self-interest over national interests have ruled the day.
We have also heard shocking reports of 10,000 rapes, an estimate that doesn't take into account the last several months, in a region where only around 9% of health facilities are functional, and of these, only a third have the capacity for clinical management of rape. Amnesty International's recent report on sexual violence in the region of Tigray is damning. The report highlights the sadistic brutality that is being inflicted on women by parties to the conflict, including members of the Ethiopian National Defense Force, the Eritrean Defense Force, the Amhara Regional Police Special Force, and Fano, an Amhara militia group. In the report, Agnes Kalamard, Amnesty International Secretary General, says, "It's clear that rape and sexual violence have been used as a weapon of war to inflict lasting physical and psychological damage on women and girls in Tigray. Hundreds have been subjected to brutal treatment aimed at degrading and dehumanizing them. Yet this is only the start of the crisis facing Tigray and other affected regions. Ethiopia is also facing the 5th largest COVID-19 outbreak in the whole of Africa. OCHA reports that only 3% of Tigrayans have been reached with essential sanitation and hygiene messages. And since members last met here to discuss this disaster, little has changed in terms of human suffering other than the extent of it has gotten worse. The UN recently stated that from 18th to 28th of October, no trucks with humanitarian supplies were able to reach Tigray, and from the 1st of July to 28th of October, only 15% of the trucks needed were able to enter the region. Senior UN staff have been denied access, including the country heads of UNICEF, the head of OCHA, and the UN recently announced that it has cancelled flights to the capital, Mekelle, and suspended aid delivery activities as a result of government-led airstrikes in the area. And we saw USAID Chief Samantha Power say that this shortage is not because food is unavailable, but because the Ethiopian government is obstructing humanitarian aid and personnel, including land convoys and air access. So I asked the Minister what assessment she has made of humanitarian access for civilians caught up in this conflict, and what consideration is being made of the growing evidence of serious human rights abuses and crimes against humanity. How is evidence such as that brought into public attention by the BBC World Service and other human rights organisations?
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. As we continue to look at U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken's trip to Africa, we turn to Ethiopia. On Wednesday, Blinken met with the Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and other top officials, including leaders from the northern Tigray region. Blinken praised the 4-month-old peace deal that ended 2 years of fighting between government troops and forces in Tigray. He called for accountability for war crimes committed without casting blame on either side.
The conflict was absolutely devastating. Hundreds of thousands killed. Widespread sexual violence against women. Millions forced to flee their homes. Many left in need of food, shelter, medicine. Hospitals, schools, businesses shelled, destroyed. The cessation of hostilities agreement is a major achievement and step forward. Saving lives, changing lives.
During his trip, Blinken announced $331 million in new U.S. humanitarian assistance for Ethiopia. To talk more about Blinken's trip there, we're joined by Tzedala Lema. She is a journalist and the founder of At a Standard, an English-language monthly news magazine based in Ethiopia. She's joining us, though, from Germany. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Tzedala. It's great to have you with us. Talk about the significance of this trip and what's actually happening in Ethiopia and in the Tigray region. How is this deal holding up?
Thank you, Amy. Good morning, and thanks for having me again. It's an important trip by the Secretary of State because the U.S. is one of the major brokers of the peace deal that was signed in November between the Tigrayan officials and the federal government. And the agreement, the peace agreement, is not really going according to what was stated in the documents that were signed in Pretoria and in Nairobi after that. So it's very important that the Secretary made this trip to push for the implementation, the full implementation of this agreement, because the implementation is lacking behind. We're not seeing so much has changed, but not enough is on the ground. So it's important for him to make that visit.
Dali, could you explain what were the terms of the agreement that you say are not being met?
The terms of the agreement, most importantly, are the establishment, the normalization of relations between the Tigray state and the federal government, and the establishment of an interim government in Tigray regional state, which is really lacking behind because the federal government, although it's not stated in the peace agreement, is holding the disbursement of the budget for the regional state until after Tigray formed its interim government, dismantled the previous government that was elected shortly before the war erupted, and established an interim government. So the federal government is still holding the budget for the regional states. Civil servants are not being paid as we speak. It's been more than 2 years. So this is lacking behind, and they need to put a lot of pressure on this to put it on fast track. other implementation of the peace agreement, the full restoration of services in the region, telecommunication and banking, although it has been restored, the level is not by any chance close to what is needed on the ground. Humanitarian access is also not that fully being implemented currently. So it's very important that the peace agreement is fully complied by both parties.
Dali, you mentioned that the U.S. was one of the main brokers of this agreement. Who were the other parties involved, and how can the agreement be implemented?
The other parties involved are the African Union itself, and the African Union has, through the support of the U.S. government, established a monitoring and verification mechanism. But we have not had any report from this office so far about the implementation of the peace agreement. We have seen initially the disarmament of heavy weaponry by the Tigrayan forces, and they have handed that over to the federal government. But foreign forces still remain on the soil of Tigray. In fact, Eritrean forces continued to be implicated in atrocities and rape against Tigrayan civilians. Amhara forces still continue occupying western Tigray and southern part of Tigray. So this report that from the verification mechanism has not surfaced so far yet. So it's being the other parties are the African Union itself. So there is a need for this verification and mechanism office to follow through what is being implemented and what is not being followed through by the parties, particularly the federal government, which has the responsibility of evacuating foreign forces from the sovereign land of Tigray.
I wanted to talk about the issue of genocide, Sadala Lema. In late 2021, Blinken said the U.S. would decide whether the crimes committed in northern Ethiopia constitute genocide. The State Department, according to a recent piece in Foreign Policy, the State Department drafted a declaration in 2021 that the Ethiopian government's atrocities in Tigray constituted genocide, according to three U.S. officials familiar with the matter, but it never released that declaration. Your response?
Yes, I think some of my colleagues on the ground yesterday tried to ask this question to the Secretary of State. And I think his response was very vague in that regard. Yes, this report, Secretary Blinken, let's first get back to it. He was the first highest level U.S. official to admit that an ethnic cleansing did take place in the early days of the war in Western Tigray. And this report now that we are learning the designation as a genocide is shelved. I think, the U.S. is trying to leverage diplomacy over the issue of human rights. I don't think the U.S. will come forth to publish this report because designating what happened in Tigray as genocide requires you to follow through. And the U.S. currently is more focused in securing the Ethiopian government side or Ethiopia as a partner, as opposed to, competing powers from the Middle East and, Russia and China. So the U.S. is in that competition of winning Ethiopia as it is, traditional ally and a bulwark of stability previously in the Horn of Africa. The region is experiencing quite a lot of competition from these competing powers. And the U.S. wanted really to have the prime minister on its side. So I don't think they will be releasing this report, although it's somewhere in the shelf sitting there.
Dali, before we conclude, if you could just give us a quick background on the war, what led to this situation and this, the commission of this, effectively what has been called a genocide.
The war started in November 2020. Previously, in September 2020, Tigray, as a federated member of the Ethiopian federal government, went ahead in holding a unilateral election for regional council members. And after that, the relationship between Tigrayan officials, led by the TPLF, the party that's governing Tigray today, and the federal government was going down the hill. They were having their sole relations previously already after the coming of the prime minister. But that election was a watershed moment that really put the final nail on the coffin for the outbreak of this war in November, shortly 2 months after Tigray held this election. So that is really at the heart of the contest between the two. And the war, the outbreak of the war was also aided and abetted by Eritrea next door, because Eritrea has historically been against, the Tigrayan, the TPLF, which was a dominating political figure in the past, previously before the prime minister came to power. So Eritrea had a score to settle with Tigray. Abiy Ahmed, as a prime minister, was unhappy that Tigrayans went ahead and held their election for local council. This was not flying well in his anticipation of centralizing power. So the two came together and the war broke out in November. After that, what took place is for the history books, very tragic unfolding, to the point that now we have a report that designated what took place in Tigray as genocide, but we may not be able to see it officially soon.
Sadala Lema, we want to thank you so much for being with us, a journalist, founder of the Addis Standard, an English-language monthly news magazine based in Ethiopia.
The humanitarian situation in Tigray is beyond imaginable. Clearly, the international community and governments like the Australian government have got to ramp up efforts to rein in the Ethiopian government. Clearly, the international community is not doing enough, and I'm hopeful that with the change of government here in Canberra, that the new government, the new Minister of Foreign Affairs, Penny Wong, might take extra steps to pressure the Ethiopians to stop what I and many other people would characterise as genocide.
This strikes at the very heart of compassion, of what we should be doing in humanitarian aid, in what we should be doing as a government to speak up about the atrocities that I've seen here. It is dreadful, truly dreadful to see, particularly so many women and children suffering unnecessary hunger when there is food available not that far away, suffering from awful, awful conditions, but also rape, murder, indeed genocide. This is very much what happened in Rwanda in 1993-94 and shouldn't be happening this year, any year, but certainly not in the modern era. It's just appalling.
When you see state-sanctioned intentional violence, sexual violence, destruction of cultural icons, mass movements, intentional mass displacements of people, I don't think you could describe this as anything other than an example of genocide, and a deeply distressing example of genocide. This is an intentional attack against the very lifeblood and the people of Tigray. I think it's unquestionable that Australia has an international obligation to lift its game in relation to Tigray. I mean, we've seen how generous Australians can be when they understand the nature of a conflict, and we've seen Australia give generously to the people of Ukraine. Well, we have similar or perhaps worse levels of appalling violence, long-standing violence in Tigray. And I think part of what this exhibition does, it educates MPs, and that's part of educating the community, so that we can see that it's time that we lifted the support for Tigray, because $6 million, which is all that Australia has given, is a drop in the ocean, given the level of need that we see in Tigray. This is urgent business, and I think you've communicated that urgency.
For the size of the population that's there, the numbers of people killed and injured and abused is staggering and horrific. I just want you to know that we are listening, and we have your back, and we'll do everything that we can in the Parliament here.
Say to the Australian Tigray community, there are people here who care. There are people like me who are doing what we can to speak up, and will continue to do that. And in fact, I'll ramp up my efforts as a direct result of what I have seen and what I've been briefed on today.
I know you're a very resilient people. I know you're very brave. Know that people here have your back, people here in the Parliament. This is above politics and has to be. And I'm sure the Australian government, the Australian Parliament will do all we can to help you.
Well, I think the message that I'd first of all give is you have extraordinary leadership here in Australia, amongst the diaspora here in Australia, who are doing what you would want them to do, to come talk directly to politicians and explain the scale of need and distress in Tigray. But I'd also hope what you get from this is a sense that you're not alone, that there's a growing number of your elected representatives who are going to be there to support you. I'm one of the Green senators in the federal parliament, but what I'd hope we see is politicians from across the political spectrum acknowledging our combined humanity, our shared humanity, and stepping up to support Tigray.
More than 40 churches have been destroyed. We know that in one massacre alone, 78 priests were killed in just one massacre. And there have been dozens and dozens of massacres that have happened in Tigray, and mostly at churches and on religious holidays.
While Russia's invasion of Ukraine has captured global headlines, the world's deadliest conflict right now is taking place in Ethiopia. A group of leading researchers recently estimated that up to 500,000 people have been killed in a brutal civil war that began there just under 2 years ago. Orthodox Christians have been among its worst victims, intentionally targeted by Ethiopia's federal government, according to opposition leaders. Some even say it's a genocide. Take a look. Hundreds of thousands of people dead, millions more displaced, Christians persecuted, and foreign powers intervening and angling for influence. It sounds an awful lot like what happened in Syria during the height of that country's recent civil war. Yet it's unfolding right now, not in the Middle East, but in the Horn of Africa, where Ethiopia has been locked in a brutal civil war since November 2020. Foreign actors like Russia, Iran, Turkey, and China are supporting Ethiopia's federal government as they seek greater influence and warm water ports in the Red Sea region. The Biden administration, meanwhile, has attempted to mediate between the warring factions and has called for negotiations. The White House is concerned that the chaos in Ethiopia will spread throughout the region. Ethiopia is the second most populous country in Africa, with close to 120 million people. Its capital city, Addis Ababa, is the headquarters of the African Union. And although Ethiopia is one of the world's oldest Christian nations, American pulpits have been mostly silent about one of the worst humanitarian crises in recent memory.
We know that more than 40 churches have been destroyed. We know that in one massacre alone, 78 priests were killed in just one massacre. And there have been dozens and dozens of massacres that have happened in Tigray, and mostly at churches and on religious holidays. There's a church called St. Mary's Mariam Dingale Church, where 20 Sunday school children were killed. 20.
Malete Bahara Maskal is an Ethiopian-American activist and business owner based in Denver who still has family in the northern region of Tigray, which has been targeted by the Ethiopian federal government. Tigray is over 95% Christian, mostly Orthodox, but with some evangelicals and Catholics as well.
Where I'm from, my hometown in Aksum, Aksum is a very holy, sacred town. There was a massacre at St. Mary's Church there where more than 700 Tigrayans were killed on a religious holiday.
The fighting began in November 2020, not long after Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed postponed parliamentary elections. Ahmed blamed COVID-19 for the decision. Yet the Tigray People's Liberation Front, or TPLF, defied Ahmed and held regional elections anyway. Although Tigrayans make up only about 7% of Ethiopia's total population, the TPLF was in power for the better part of 30 years after helping to topple a communist military dictatorship that ruled Ethiopia during the 1970s and 80s. The TFLP eventually stepped aside in 2018 after widespread protests, and Ahmed then came to power. Many Tigrayans believe that Ahmed launched the federal government's invasion of the region in late 2020 because he wants to weaken the TPLF's influence for good. He's used harsh measures to accomplish that alleged goal, including a blockade on food and any communication in and out of Tigray. You have referred to this as genocide, yet many people watching right now have probably not heard about this. What's going on in Ethiopia right now? Why do you think more people, especially Christians, the body of Christ around the world, are not aware of what's happening on the ground in Ethiopia right now? Ethiopia, which, by the way, is a Bible land mentioned many times in the Bible.
First of all, there's a complete blackout on the region. All the services have been cut to the people of Tigray. More than 7 million people have not had access to their bank accounts for 19 months. They have not had running water in the state, no electricity, no internet. So we're not able to get their stories.
Global food shortages this summer have made the situation in Tigray even more dire.
We're talking about 7 million people who don't have access to even food. When the federal and federally aligned soldiers came into Tigray, they burned farmlands. Tigrayans are farmers. Their farmlands were burned. The prime minister will not allow food aid to come into Tigray. He will not allow fuel to come into Tigray. So recently, a little bit of food has crossed the border, the state border, but they can't distribute it because there's no fuel in Tigray.
For Ethiopian Christians, this kind of hardship and persecution is nothing new.
It's important to understand that persecution has always been part of being a Christian in Ethiopia. This is a country that formerly was under communist control. So if you talk to an old Ethiopian Christian, they will talk about the persecution that they faced under the communists. So persecution happening for them is not a new thing. It's not something that they're really shocked by. They really see it as part of following Jesus Christ. Of course, will be persecuted when we follow Christ. That's what he said would happen.
Todd Nettleton is the chief of media relations and message integration for the Voice of the Martyrs, an organization that monitors Christian persecution around the world. He notes that Ethiopia is mentioned in the Bible dozens of times, and that the country is said to have embraced Christianity as early as the 4th century. Ethiopians even say that they house the Ark of the Covenant at a church in Aksum, which is located in the beleaguered Tigray region.
They trace their lineage back to the Queen of Sheba going to see King Solomon when he was in charge in Jerusalem, and they would trace their church lineage back to that. And in fact, many of their teachings have brought forward some of the Jewish teachings from King Solomon's time.
Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has claimed to be an evangelical Christian who converted from Islam. He won a Nobel Peace Prize in 2018 for brokering peace with neighboring Eritrea after decades of hostilities. Now he's invited Eritrean troops into Ethiopia, where they've allegedly carried out massacres in Tigray. And Eritrea isn't the only foreign actor that's now involved in Ethiopia. This has become a proxy war of sorts. Abiy Ahmed, the prime minister who you mentioned, he's invited in Eritrean troops, but also Turkey, Russia, China, all involved in the war in Ethiopia right now.
Iran, Turkey, the UAE, China, all of these people provided military support in the form of drones, primarily in training on how to use drones. Russia and China have successfully blocked any conversation at the UN around these atrocious human rights abuses that are happening in Tigray.
Bahara Maskal says control of the strategic Horn of Africa and the Red Sea is the goal. For example, Russia is currently building a military base in Eritrea.
Who do you want to be influencing policy in the Horn if 12% of the world's trade is passing through the Red Sea? This is an important question. The U.S. does not want to take a back seat to the Gulf states in this conversation. We need to be a part of that conversation. It matters to us economically. It matters to us as Christians that this is a predominantly Christian state, and all of this shared history is being destroyed.
The Biden administration is now attempting to bring the Ethiopian federal government and representatives from Tigray to the negotiating table in an effort to end the fighting. Nettleton says the outcome for Christians in Ethiopia could have larger implications for the gospel in Africa.
And they are also a mission-minded church that is sending out missionaries not only within their own country, but also into surrounding nations and across the continent of Africa. And so to see that church defeated would not only affect the nation of Ethiopia, it would affect the entire continent of Africa.
We will continue to report on the plight of Ethiopian Christians and the persecuted church around the world.
Hi, I'm Doug McKelway, and thank you for watching Centerpoint. We hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure you hit the subscribe button and tap the bell icon so you're notified every time a new video is posted. Leave a comment below and keep the conversation going by sharing this video with a friend who needs to see it. Thanks for watching. We'll see you back here tomorrow.